Habakkuk 3 5 to 6 says, Plague went before him, pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age old hills collapsed. His ways are eternal. Plague and pestilence are signs of God's judgment. The word pestilence can also mean flame. It comes from a word meaning to burn, and so verse 5 could also be translated as flames went forth before his feet. It's a picture of God's awesome power and holiness as he walks through the land, judging the earth for its sins. The nations tremble before him, and even the mountains and the hills crumble and collapse in his presence. The word collapse in verse 6 literally means to bow down. And so there is a sense of God's creation bowing down in worship before him. The mountains may be ancient, the hills may have stood since ages old, but God's ways are eternal, and so they all fall down before him. Verse 7 says, I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, and the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Here Habakkuk pictures the Cushan and the Midianite people who live in tents in the desert, trembling at God's appearance as he passes them in the wilderness. After describing God's awesome appearance in verses 3 to 7, in verses 8 to 15, Habakkuk describes God's conquest of all his enemies. In verses 8 to 9, Habakkuk describes God's conquest over the rivers and the sea. Were you angry with the rivers, O Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode with your horses and your victorious chariots? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. There are three different words for God's anger in these verses: anger, wrath, and rage. The word for anger means hot burning. The word for wrath means breath or nostrils. The word for rage means to pour out or overflow. Taken together, they speak of God's burning anger, the fierce blast of breath from his nostrils, his overflowing judgment poured over his nostrils, over his enemies because of their sin. Habakkuk wants us to understand that yes, God is there and God conquers all his enemies. That is a word of warning. But Habakkuk also wants us to understand that God comes to deliver his people. That is a word of comfort. So on one level, verses 3 and 15 give us this dramatic picture of God's coming up from the south and completely destroying all the enemies in his path. But on another level, the song is also full of imagery relating to God's dealing with his people Israel. In many ways, this song is a dramatic retelling of God's deliverance of his people. Teman and Paran in verse 3 reminds of God's presence with his people in the wilderness where he revealed himself to Israel and then led them onto the promised land. The thunderstorm and earthquake imagery is a reminder of God's meeting with his people at Mount Sinai to give them the 10 Commandments. Plague and pestilence recalls God's 10 plagues on Egypt, resulting in Israel's deliverance. The victory of the rivers and sea are meant to remind us of Israel's miraculous crossing of the Red Sea and Jordan River. Remind yourself of these mighty deeds of God in the past when you wonder, is God there? Be blessed.